Sharon Sprowls on our staff is going to present to you today has been under development for the better part of a couple of years. It's one of the final work products from the grant we received from the federal government through HUD under their Sustainable Communities Initiative. Much of that grant was spent on CEQA streamlining in the transit priority areas, which were options available to us through the passage of Senate Bill 375. This is not an action item for the board. We proposed, and as to HUD and as part of our requirements, that when this paper was done, we would present it to the key policymakers in the region and have a discussion about it. As I indicated in my front-end piece, couple pages, sort of trying to pull some of the data out and start to tease out some of the policy implications maybe for us. The primary purpose of this paper is to get in one place a lot of information about housing that somewhat surprisingly and unfortunately has never been in one place before. We hear a lot from you whenever we talk about your favorite topic of RENA, your frustration that issues related to long-range planning and zoning are not often enough connected to housing production issues. And so one of the things that I'm hoping we've accomplished with this paper is started to at least pull some of that information into one document. And so Sharon is going to give you a quick overview of this. We're hoping that it will stimulate some questions, maybe some concerns, some discussion amongst you today, and then we will take all that into consideration over the next couple of months as we put the final touches on this paper. Depending on how the discussion goes today, we may come back to you at the committee level, and this would be through Director McGlashan's committee, the Land Use and Natural Resources Committee, to plow a little bit deeper on some of these issues. So with that, I'll have Sharon give a presentation, and then she and I, as well as Joe Concannon, who is our project manager for this project, will be available for questions.
Well, I can give you a little background while Rochelle goes and gets the PowerPoint. I think we had a miscommunication about who was reading it. So the first slide actually was just about the purpose of this, so I can go over that. We, as Mike said, we really were attempting to pull together a range of information from a lot of the housing documents from the region. So there are, as you probably are aware, there are many different documents that all of your staff have to prepare. Plans for the federal government, plans, housing elements, reports annually on housing programs and spending, et cetera. There's also analyses of impediments to fair housing that are done by 10 of our jurisdictions, as well as the state Housing and Community Development Department for 15 of the smaller jurisdictions. So there's just a kind of a range of information out there. There's also the Department of Finance does estimates of our housing in any given year, which gives us a sense of our housing growth. So we really looked at a whole broad range of information to try and provide you some data today. And unfortunately, we kind of meet the slide, so we'll wait just a second.
Sorry, do we have any clue as to how long that's going to take?
You do have a copy in front of you, so I suppose we can get started there, and then as we have the slides, we'll move forward.
Just roll it.
So the first slide you have is just a kind of a reminder as context of what is in the MTP SCS as far as our expectations or our projections for housing, new housing growth over the life of the plan. So it's about 303,000 units is what we currently have, and we had broken that down by projections for the different housing product types. So that gives you sort of the context as we were looking at how does our housing production fit in with the future of housing in our region. So the second slide that is titled Average Annual Housing Production. So we went back and we looked at the last 2 decades, from 1990 to 2000 and from 2000 to 2010. And we looked at it by product type. So, and compared what we produced in terms of single-family detached versus single-family attached multifamily. And what we saw was that we have been actually producing more of the attached and multifamily. So about 22% was single-family attached multifamily in 2000-2010 compared to 1990-2000. So we've been increasing in that area. And if you look at the next slide, which is the changes to housing production 2000 to 2012, this goes back to some slides that I think you've seen previously, which is that really the sum of our story is that our share of small lot development has really been increasing since the blueprint was adopted. And additionally, for attached projects alone, so okay, let me catch up. Here we are. So for the attached share of units, essentially in the last several years, we've really seen a significant increase from 2008 to 2012. 33% of new housing units produced were attached. So, and the MTP SES calls for about 43% over the life of the plan.
Can I just get some clarification?
Sure.
You're using small lot and attached interchangeably, or when you say, is that category always attached, or is it all small lots attached or unattached, or?
In the top chart, it was small lot attached put together. In the bottom chart, it's actually just attached. So those of you who are at the various committee meetings this month saw Bruce's presentation about the monitoring report. And this is a slide drawn from his work, just reminding you about what he had found in terms of household median income dropping from 2000 until 2011, and that we've really seen a loss of wealth. He had estimated a decrease in aggregate household income of about $5.5 billion. And this does have implications for people's ability to afford their homes, as shown in the next slide. So in looking at what are called cost burden households, and this is data that HUD produces. It's sort of a special piece out of the census and the American Community Survey that they asked for. It shows that we really have had a challenge in providing housing for the range of incomes in our region. So cost burden means paying over 30% of household income for housing, which is about the recommended amount so that people have enough income to cover other needs in their lives. So what we found was about 40% of the households in our region were paying more than that recommended 30% of income. About a quarter of homeowners and nearly 1 in 5 of renter households. And we looked to make sure that that wasn't just about kind of growth in our region. And what we found was that that increase in cost burden households really outstripped the increase in housing units over the decades. So it was kind of a significant increase in our region's ability to afford their housing. And we broke down that household cost burden by race and ethnicity as well as senior households. And what we saw was that there's a higher cost burden for minority households, ranging Asian households up to African American households, who were 59% of African American households. For those households considered senior, I don't know how many of us consider seniors being 62 and above, but for a household with someone 62 and over, about 36% of households were also considered cost burdened. And we found that about 18% of our households, nearly 1 in 5, were paying over 50% of income for housing, which is a really significant cost burden. These data do have margins of error, so we want to caution you a little bit, but they give us some picture of what's going on in our region. So one of the ways to make make housing more affordable is to focus on the combined cost of housing and transportation. And there it's recommended that households not spend more than about 45% of their income on housing plus transportation costs. Some of you may know that the Center for Neighborhood Technology has kind of led the field in developing a methodology to provide data on those combined housing plus transportation costs. And based on their figures and some work by some of the consultants working on TOD in our region, they found that those nearer quality transit have lower combined costs as a percent of their income, about 44.5% versus over 54% region-wide. So it can cost you less if you live in an area near quality transit. So the MTP, your plan has really called for more of that kind of combination to occur. The MTP SES forecasts over 114,000 new housing units, about 38% of all new housing units in the plan, in transit priority areas in the region, and those are within a half-mile of quality transit service by 2035. And the emphasis there really is on attached and small lot products that may help reduce housing plus transportation costs for the residents of those areas. So as you'll recall, those of you who went through the process, the MTP SES included a variety of market research on the changing demographics in our region and across the nation that are leading to changes in housing demand, including for those smaller lot and attached products closer to transit and services. So we've seen these demographic changes, the change in our aging of our population, the diversity of our population, also fewer households with children at home, more people with disabilities, with less income, as we just saw, and an increasing proportion of renters and those who are single households or who are not really family households. That was more the tradition. And those trends are definitely projected to continue. So as part of our research, we identified a number of challenges to providing that broader supply of housing choices. And again, those impediments came out of some of the plans that I mentioned, plans and reports that your staffs complete, as well as some of the state information and from Housing and Urban Development. So we just looked at some of the changes to household economics, their incomes and wealth. In terms of development costs, whether or not ownership and rental projects pencil out is often dependent on whether there's housing subsidy for the affordable portion. And unfortunately, a number of those sources of housing subsidy have really declined. Through federal sequestration, federal housing funds are declining. The state bond funding has pretty much ended. Redevelopment is gone. And as Mike noted in his attachment piece, there are definitely also a number of areas with concentrated poverty that are particularly challenging to address. So this was kind of a new concept for us, but HUD asked us as part of our grant work to look at areas in our region with what they call a concentration of poverty, and especially areas that have a high rate of minority households in poverty. So they gave us a definition of census tracts that would be considered either concentrated areas of poverty, or CAPS, new acronym, or racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, an RCAP or an ECAP. And essentially those RCAPs and ECAPs are a subset of the concentrated areas of poverty. So in analyzing our region using these HUD definitions, what we found was about 35 of our 504 census tracts, or about 7% of all census tracts in the region, that fit HUD's definition of a concentrated area of poverty. It's about 7% of our region's population. And so for the areas that meet the definition of a racially or ethnically concentrated area, those accounted for about 29 or 6% of the region's tracts and population. So we wanted to show you a map, a visual of those areas, and I'm going to kind of take you through time. So these were the areas in 1990. We did this by decades. So these were the racially, ethnically concentrated areas of poverty in Sacramento, Yolo counties. The striped areas were those that still exist, that either were new or continuations of those from 1990. And the green areas are those that were in 2010, either as a continuation or new areas. And then I'll show you the concentrated areas of poverty as well, doing the same thing. So this is 1990. You'll see there's a broader swath. Some of these areas, like that large swath in Yolo County, it's partly because the population is fairly small. The striped areas, again, are those in 2000, and the blue areas are those in 2010. And if you're interested in seeing some of those maps, including for Yuba and Sutter counties, and those areas are mainly near the Air Force Base, they're in Chapter 7 of the report that we gave you. Go back to this. So another thing that we did to better understand the rental market in our region was we worked with all the jurisdictions on kind of a first ever inventory of the rental units in our region that were built with some form of public subsidy. And we were able to identify about 45,000 units that had built with a whole variety of state, federal funds. It's about 5% of our region's total housing stock, and we broke it down by county. And here, this is just a map of the location of those as of 2012. And you can see many of them are concentrated in more of the central areas of different parts of the region. We also did a comparison of the proportion of those subsidized units that we were able to identify with the proportion of population and households in the 6 counties. So the blue is the county's proportion of the regional population, the red is their proportion of households, and the green is the proportion of subsidized units that we identified. Move on to the next slide. So as we saw, many of the households with challenges are renters, we looked in more depth at the rental market, as well as those rental subsidy programs. And this slide shows that across the Sacramento region, average rents have been increasing while vacancies have been declining, especially since the major housing downturn in 2009. Partly because homes have also been bought by investors and turned into rental property. So we're seeing some of those declines as people moved around. In 2001, the average rent in the 4-county Sacramento area was about $800 a month, and by 2012 it was close to $1,000 a month. And there has been some increase in the Yuba Sutter area, although rents there are somewhat lower. So some of you who've been on the board for a while may remember your city or county joining what was called the Sacramento Regional Compact for Production of Affordable Housing. This was a voluntary pilot program of SACOG members between 2004 and 2010. And basically the participating jurisdictions pledged that at least 10% of all new housing construction would meet an affordability standard. It was kind of broken into a 4%, a 4%, and a 2% for very low, and moderate income households. So we compared the identified units that we could find against what the growth has been, and found that basically we did exceed the compact standards over the life of the compact. And although RHNA is a zoning program, we thought it might be useful just to compare the last RHNA allocation with the affordable production that we were able to identify over a 7-year period, just to see, what happened. And even though these data include the worst years of the recession, they show that the region did make some progress in meeting different income category needs, including the very low, which requires the most subsidy. So in the new RHNA cycle, which is 2013 to 2021, as most of you will recall, we we did an allocation based on about 105,000 units by income. So the top table is that breakdown of units by different income categories. At the bottom is the pipeline that we were able to identify of multifamily housing that's either in production 2013 to 14, or that appears to be proposed or may be coming in the pipeline, and came up with about 18,000 units. And this may look encouraging. We're in the first year of the RHNA. What we don't know is how many of these multifamily units will be market rate, or how they'll fit with the various income categories. So that's kind of an unknown at this point. So another way that the region provides housing support is through housing choice vouchers. And vouchers essentially allow a recipient of the voucher to go rent an apartment, a townhome, a single-family home from a willing landlord in the private market. And the vouchers generally are proportional to a region's population. We talked to all the public housing authorities to find what were their waiting lists like, and found that there is a really long list of qualified households who are also seeking rental assistance beyond those receiving vouchers. And Sutter County is planning to provide us more information. Another program that does help people access housing is basically fair housing education and enforcement. We have 11 local agencies throughout the region, plus state and federal offices, that help people understand fair housing laws and help with enforcement. This slide shows the complaints between 2007 and 2012 regarding practices by landlords in the private market between 2007 and 2012. Disability, race, color were the leading reasons for housing discrimination complaints. And upon investigation, about half, 51% of these complaints were determined to actually have cause. But that gives you an idea of what people complain about. So as we were reviewing local plans and analyses of impediments to fair housing, we also identified a number of impediments to home ownership in the region. Not surprisingly, there are still some foreclosures, short sales. Prices, as you've been seeing, are rising in the home market. Cash investors have been coming in quite significant quantities. There are a number of households who had subprime loans, who had foreclosure histories, making it harder to access mortgage credit. And there's been, the supply of new homes particularly has been limited because of the recession. We looked at funds coming into the region. I think this is the first time this has ever been done as well, over the period from 2003 to 2012 that helped support housing development, access, housing programs. There's a lot more detail on these programs in Chapter 8 of your report, but it gives you a sense. We had over $1.1 billion that came into our region in some form of housing program over that time period. Some of these are federal programs: community development block grant, home, emergency shelter grants, people with AIDS, the neighborhood stabilization program that was part of the ERA funding, tax credits, which are ongoing, and then the state bond programs, which are pretty much gone. So unfortunately, some of these sources are definitely on the decline, but that's been our history. And lastly, we looked at a variety of policies that jurisdictions have been adopting to support housing in their areas. Reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities. A number of communities have linkage fees that provide out-of-development funds toward housing, inclusionary zoning, density bonuses required by law that give people an opportunity to build a little bit more on a parcel. The rezoning that some of your communities may be going through once your housing elements are done. A number of people have transit-oriented development policies. These are discussed in more detail in Chapter 9, and we really are looking for more models from around the region of policies and programs that we can add to the report. So this is a draft, and we'd really encourage you, if you have things you'd like to highlight, please let us know. And lastly, we are here at SACOG doing a variety of work that's really related, we thought, to the MTP SES, this housing report. We just wanted to bring that to your attention. So as part of the work, we've had discussions with the state and federal agencies on how to streamline and align some of their requirements for local jurisdictions. So lots of housing planning requirements. We have housing element law in California. Could we make it easier on people? We only have so many resources, and these plans don't necessarily align in terms of content and timing. We've been looking at new tools and especially data to help support our jurisdictions on transit-oriented development, on housing planning. We did a lot for the housing element process in terms of providing standardized data that everyone was able to use. They were very appreciative of that, your staffs. We've been doing a variety of analysis on how to lower costs for development in areas with access to services, how to capitalize on CEQA streamlining. We'll be doing more with the recent legislation that passed just this year, and helping our member agencies to the extent that we can in securing federal and state resources. So Mike's going to come up and we'll take some questions. Also, Joe Concannon as well, who's helped work on this report, and if there's anyone else we need to draw in. Thank you.